Herman, I'd just like to raise this question because Rommel was saying, obviously there's an international game, no? And Duterte is playing along, no? Or is playing based on these issues. No? But if there's anything that we can see as well, no, there are trade-offs, no, to this game, no, to the gains that he gets, no, specifically China, because there are now issues of, in return for these investments, it would mean surrendering, or that's the popular impression, no, that sovereignty, national territory, and areas are being surrendered, no. So I'd just like to get your opinion on this, Herman, and also this notion, no, that when we were talking about foreign policy, if you notice, Rommel, no, we were saying this is what Duterte is doing. Duterte is, I think, in a democratic society, foreign policy should be decided upon by people through institutions, then represented by the president in these, no. Where I'm thinking it might be different. No? It's as if you were saying Duterte talks, or the president talks to these particular heads of state, and then he brings back whatever policies he obtains or he negotiates there, he brings it back to us and then is implemented. I think there's is there something problematic or something we're giving away with regards to that dynamic, no? This one person, this very relatively backward flow of diplomatic policy.
Well, if you look at our constitution, the president is also our principal diplomat, right? In other words, that is a constitutional provision, right? So you can't really understate, so to speak, the responsibility of the president as a person, as a personality, as far as foreign policy is actually concerned. I think what is interesting about the Duterte administration is the extent to which he has personalized, no, especially the relationship with China, right? So he's not just talking about Philippine-China relations, right? He's talking about him and in China. I need China, right? He actually mentioned that a few years back. So it's in a sense, no, it goes beyond the idea of his responsibilities as the chief diplomat of the Philippines. The whole thing is now about him, you know, as the principal initiator of foreign policy for the Philippines. But at the same time, you know, and I think this is where these are some of the things that we might actually miss out when we talk about China, for instance, right? There's nothing really, if you look at our relationship with China, the relationship has always been, you know, actually good, so to speak, okay? And this is something that China finds odd, so to speak. Why is it that Filipinos find China has a lot of suspicion for Chinese intentions, for instance? But if you go back to I mean, historically speaking, if you go back to our history with China, no, okay, not too far. Let's say at the time when we first established diplomatic relations with Communist China. This was during the time of Marcos, right?
Mao Zedong actually visited.
Yes, exactly, right? Our relationship with China has never been intense, so to speak, but it has never been negative, right? So in other words, in fact, there were, you might actually say that move of Marcos in the first place was directed at the idea of communist insurgency in the Philippines, the idea of trying to cut off, you know, material support that the People's Republic of China might actually provide the New People's Army, for instance. Be that as it may, you know, there hasn't really been any major issue as far as our relationship with China is actually concerned. Now, of course, this is before China became a regional hegemon, right? A powerful state, the peaceful rise of China and all of that. And this was before China began to probe into its ability to actually make its presence felt, no? Beyond the South China Sea, the West Philippine Sea, right? So there are those kinds of things that we actually have to understand, right? In other words, what I'm actually trying to say is that the relationship with China that we had under the Aquino administration is actually a deviation from the normal kind of relationship that we had.
Seems to be the normal, the new normal.
New normal, no?
You could actually make the argument that Duterte is just bringing us back into what was actually the normal relationship that we had with China. Of course, the problem there is that this goes against popular perceptions, of that relationship that we have with China. Okay, the kinds of perceptions that were shaped by Chinese activities in the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea, for instance. Okay, and so when you talk about the idea that we're just trying to bring the relationship back to a normal kind of condition, right? It's very difficult. The language that we see is, of course, things like the pivot to China, for instance, right? And so it's not easy to actually make that kind of argument that people will understand that particular administrative or this administration's attempts to actually normalize the relationship with China. And what doesn't help is that you can juxtapose that with his rhetoric, not what the government actually does, but his rhetoric as far as the EU is concerned, the United States. In other words, as far as our traditional friends are actually concerned, he's very hostile in the rhetoric that he actually uses, right? And so you get the sense that he's changing, the direction of our foreign policy. Okay, although if you look at it objectively, to a large extent, we're just going back to what we might say would be a normal relationship with China. Now, of course, the other thing that you have to be very careful about is that China is no longer the China that it was before, right? So if we're talking about normalizing relationships, right? China under Mao Zedong, Hu Jintao later on, is very different from the kind of China that we're actually facing now under Xi Jinping, right? So in that kind of context, it's also very difficult to say, we're just normalizing things, right? Precisely because it's a different China that we're actually dealing with now, right? And dealing with that China might require us to think about, well, okay, can we do it on our own, right? In the way that you were actually talking about it earlier on, that Duterte actually is using this as in a strategic gambit, right? Trying to normalize relations with China, but at the same time making sure that even as he says those things about the United States, that things are actually normal there. Okay, so in other words, if you are actually personalizing the way that we approach this geopolitical situation, this new geopolitical situation right now, the question there is, does it actually mean that we change the nature of our relationship, especially within the context of the emerging international order that we have right now, right? So things like multilateral institutions and the way that we tend to ignore that, withdrawing from the ICC, for instance, right? And the way that President Duterte has threatened, for instance, in the past, that may as well withdraw from the UN because it hasn't been able to do anything anyway, right? So in other words, this is the international system that we've had in the past, post-Cold War situation, right? A system that has seen to the emergence of multilateral institutions, the creation of international norms, and so on. And here is a president in the Philippines actually saying that I'm not too happy about the way those norms are actually operating, so to speak, right? And so when you start seeing that, and the way that we're trying to reorient, so to speak, the kind of foreign policy that we have under the Duterte administration, then the question that we have is there some sort of coherence in the way that all of these things are actually being brought about?
Thank you. Which then leads me to my next question, Rommel, because Herman was talking about a gambit. You were talking about how Duterte is playing a game or playing an international game of diplomatic game with these heads of state, with these governments. But assuming he just stays for the next 3 years, what would be what would be the long-term impact of this game of this highly personalized, this parang Game of Thrones, no? Or it's like Monopoly rin, no? Parang you're trying to this diplomatic game, no? This diplomatic economic game, no? With these heads of state, with these governments, no? What would happen once Duterte leaves power and the new head of state would now be faced with the consequences, with the realities created by this highly personalized, highly I guess the popular, I think it's an extension of what he's doing in populist relationship with these states. What do you think about that?
Well, there are uncertainties after Duterte, but we need to ask whether what are the gains of the Duterte administration and what have we exchanged in terms of our foreign policy. So look at China. What have we gained? We gain access to Scarborough Shoal. Okay. Now we can freely move our troops to a resupply and rotation mission in our 9 occupied geographic features in the West Philippine Sea. Although Chinese are still around, but we can still do things that we failed to do before. Like for example, now we can now repair the runway of Pag-asa Island, and we can now have a port in Pag-asa Island. Before, China was apprehending our ships carrying construction materials, but in terms of Pag-asa Island, China is allowing passage of those ships because of our understanding with China. So that's what we are gaining now. But the trade-off is we need to set aside the decision of the International Arbitral Tribunal, and at the same time, we need to solve our problems with China bilaterally. Now we have what we call the Duterte Doctrine now in the South China Sea, and that is the bilateral consultative mechanism with China on the South China Sea. And China is offering this kind of model now with Malaysia, and offering this model now with Brunei, and other claimants like Vietnam. Also, Vietnam is not accepting that kind of model. So that's the kind of exchange that we need to do. Now, with the United States, what have we exchanged? Well, the exchange is that we don't prevent the United States from its freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. In fact, we're allowing American access to this thing. Okay. And at the same time, what have we gained? Well, we're still receiving foreign military assistance. We're still receiving excess defense articles. We still have access to international military education and training. We still have all these things with the United States. And as a result of the current meeting in Honolulu, we want to have more from the United States. And what's the exchange? Then we will provide more freedom, more access for the United States to conduct its freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, which puts China in a puzzle. Why are you doing this? So it's the guessing game scenario. So those things. How about with Japan? So we gained a lot from Japan. We received 10 patrol ships for the Coast Guard, 10 40-meter ship, and 2 additional 80-meter ships for the Coast Guard. We have transfer of defense technologies now with Japan. Okay. So what's the exchange for that? The exchange is we will provide Japan access to our joint military exercise with the United States, and freedom access to their planes to visit us every now and then, access to their to their ships to visit us every now and then, and also we're doing a lot of intelligence exchange with Japan. Okay? And our communication procedure with Japan at the defense level is better than our communication with China. We don't have such kind of channels of communication, and that is why China also wants to elevate our defense ties with China. With China. Now we are now resuming the annual defense security talk with China. So those are the things that our current government is doing now. What is now the long-term consequence of that? We don't know. In 2022, we don't know whether the next president will have the same style with the government. But what we know is that our alliance will continue. Our defense relationship with Japan will continue. But our relationship with China is very, very fragile. In fact, I always describe our relationship with China as a castle built on sand. It's not institutionalized. But with Japan and United States, it's grounded on strong institutions. But with China is very, very fragile. And that is why China is rushing up institutionalizing everything by 2022.
Just so sort of like to formalize the pivot, so to speak, no na. But it's interesting, no, how you said it's a gamble where Duterte is, or the government is friends with everyone, while at the same time everyone, all of their allies are also watchful, no, of each action. No? Any thoughts, Herman, before we proceed with the synthesis from both of you?
Like I said, one of the things that becomes important here is the extent to which the Duterte administration has personalized the task of normalizing relations with China. And as Rommel was actually pointing out, that on the part of China, it behooves them to actually push forward the institutionalization of relations with the Philippines. It's going to be interesting, as to how this becomes a part of the way that the presidential elections, if you will, will actually be conducted. Whether foreign policy, normally foreign policy is not something that factors into how people make a decision on who it is that they will actually vote for, right? But what's interesting is the extent to which the issue of China has made foreign policy an important part of the political consciousness of the electorate, right? And whether this is actually going to factor into that, the extent to which who the candidates, whoever the candidates might actually be, and the extent to which they'll be addressing that particular question. Although my suspicion is that, again, this is going to be a post-election issue, not an election issue. In other words, I don't think that the question of who it is that people will actually choose to take the place of the Duterte administration is going to be dependent on the positions of those candidates, regarding our relationship with China. The question, of course, is what happens after the elections, right? In other words, will the lack of institutionalization of the relationship with China have an effect on how a post-Duterte Philippine-China relationship will actually look like, right? And that's something that's actually going to be something that would be that we should actually look forward to in terms of looking at.
Thank you. So just to conclude this session, perhaps a few thoughts. No, Rommel, what do you think are the critical issues that we should, as citizens, be engaged in, monitoring, discussing, in these very interesting times? No, what do you think are the critical issues we should be aware of?
Well, internally, the critical issue that we need to watch is the change of the constitution. So, because if we change the constitution, that would really affect our country a lot. So, right now, our constitution requires that the president should only have 6 years in term. That's why we cannot. It's very difficult for us to sustain a lot of effort. So that's one. Although we have problems of communist insurgency, more insurgency, for me, critical issue is the constitutional change, because it will have long-term impact on our nation. Externally, I think our immediate security concern is the situation in the West Philippine Sea, because it has a lot of repercussions economically and strategically for the Philippines. Now, when it comes to the nature of the current government, if you will look at the overall approach of the current government, President Duterte is not in fact changing policy. It's the same policy that we have with China, with Japan, with the United States, domestically almost the same policy. But he has different approach and different priorities. It is where you can find the difference of Duterte. Whether this approach and priorities will be sustained after 2022, we don't know. But if they don't change the constitution, and we'll still have the constitution by 2022, and we will still use the same constitution by 2022 and beyond, then there is a strong likelihood that a new president might change the overall approach and priorities.
And again, after
Yeah,
6 years.
and again after 6, because that's the very nature of the presidential system that we have. And secondly, because of the presidential system that we have, if you will look at our constitution, we really created a very strong president in our constitution. And that is the nature of our political system right now.
Thank you very much, Rommel. How about you, Herman? Just a few parting words regarding critical issues of interesting times in the Philippines.
Like what I said at the start, that the dependence on the persona of the president as far as decision making and the perceptions of Filipinos about our politics is actually concerned is an illustration of how personalized we look at politics, and that brings us back to the issue of weak institutions, right? If we're going back to the issue of human security, the effectiveness of an attempt to actually increase human security in the Philippines will actually depend quite a bit on the strength of those institutions, the capacity of those institutions to actually address the kinds of issues that are related to human security issues. And a tendency to be populist, to strengthen populist populist positions in the Philippines is not helping that particular aspect. Now, of course, you can always make the argument that we never had strong institutions in the first place. But again, if we're talking aspirationally, then human security depends quite a bit on the strengthening of our institutions, on capacitating institutions to be able to do the jobs that they're supposed to do effectively. And I think what we're seeing right now is a tendency on the part of traditional Philippine politics to undermine the processes which would actually lead to the strengthening of those institutions right now.
Thank you very much, Herman. So just to conclude this session, if there's anything that we can gain from the discussion so far, it's that participation is key. As discussions on local and international policies are concerned, while there is a popular perception on issues, it is imperative that we have a well-nuanced as well as a well-informed view, and not just be driven by emotions, by the cliches. There might be some validity to these popular perceptions, but it is necessary for us to critically engage them and then later on decide whether these perceptions, these issues impact our degree and our nations as a community, our perspectives on security and quality of life. Once again, thank you very much, Rommel and Herman, for accommodating us for today's session. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next session.